Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are continuing our Zen 4 review tour, this time with the Ryzen 7 7700X. Now from a gaming perspective, this is the model that I've been most interested to check out, as it's an 8-core 16-thread CPU using a single CCD, which should mean when it comes to gaming it's going to deliver the best performance. So I'll certainly be looking into that. But before we do, let's quickly go over the specs. Much of this information has already been covered in our Zen 4 announcement video, but for those of you not yet up to speed, here's the rundown. The Ryzen 7 7700X is an 8-core 16-thread processor that clocks between 4.7 and 5.4 GHz depending on the workload. It's made up of a single 5nm core complex die or CCD, along with a 6nm I/O die, packs a 32MB L3 cache, 6MB of L2, DDR5 support, 28 PCIe 5.0 lanes, a 105W TDP, and is designed for the new AM5 socket, so there's a lot going on here. Now, quite surprisingly, whereas its predecessor, the 5800X, featured a launch price, or MSRP, of $450 US, the 7700X has dropped to $400 US, so that's an 11% discount for what should be a much faster processor. Though I should note that at present the 5800X can be had for as little as $280, so technically the Zen 4 8-core model is coming in at a massive 43% premium. So given that, it will want to be rather snappy. A closer matchup in terms of pricing would be the 5800X 3D, which currently costs $430, so slightly more than the 7700X, and that's going to make for a very interesting matchup. There's really a lot more to go over, but we'll talk about many of the new features and changes as we work through the review. So let's go over the test system specs, and then we'll get on with it. I've been busy for the past few weeks updating all of our CPU data, and as a result we have 17 CPUs for comparison. For the AM4 platform, I've got a range of Zen 2 and Zen 3 CPUs with popular models such as the Ryzen 5 3600, Ryzen 7 3700X, and of course the Ryzen 5 5600X. But there are half a dozen more models also included. Then I've got the Intel 10th Gen Core series with popular models from the Core i5, i7 and i9 ranges, and due to time I will be skipping the 11th Gen series because that was a bit of a flop in our opinion. Then for the 12th Gen Core series of processors, I've tested using DDR4 3200 dual rank CL14 memory and DDR5 6400 single rank CL32 memory, and we have from the Core i3 12100 up to the Core i9 12900K. The new AM5 test system is based on the MSI Meg X670E Ace, and AMD has insisted all reviewers use the supplied DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, so that's what we've done. Finally, please note all testing was conducted using the GeForce RTX 3090 Ti, Windows 11, and resizable bar was enabled for all configurations. Okay, let's get into it. Just quickly before we dive into the blue bar graphs, here's a look at clock behavior in Cinebench R23. After an hour of load testing, the 7700X maintained an all-core frequency of 5.1 GHz. Now this frequency was sustained using the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler installed inside the Be Quiet Silent Base 802. Then, for single-core workloads, the 7700X appeared to maintain a clock frequency of 5.55 GHz, so 150 MHz above the advertised clock frequency. First up we have the Cinebench R23 results, and here we find the 7700X roughly matched the previous generation's 12-core part, the 5900X, coming in just 3% slower. This did though make it 13% slower than the 12700K, which can be had for roughly the same price, suggesting that productivity benchmarks might not be all that smooth sailing for the new 8-core Zen 4 processor. Single core performance, on the other hand, is slightly greater than that of the 12700K, though only ever so slightly. But in terms of single core performance, that does make the 7700X one of the best CPUs on the market right now. The 7-zip file manager compression performance is amazing, and this has been the case with all Zen 4 processors that we've looked at so far. Here it can be seen beating the 16-core 3950X while coming in behind the previous generation 16-core 5950X by a mere 7% margin. Half the cores, yet just 7% slower. That's a pretty amazing result. All of that said, it was 8% slower than the 12700K, so despite offering a huge leap forward from the previous generation, it's still a little bit disappointing compared to Alder Lake given the price. Though it is worth noting that AMD's SMT is far more powerful for decompression work, and as a result the 7700X crushes the 12700K here, offering almost 20% greater performance, basically matching the Core i9 12900K. The Blender Open Data results placed the 7700X alongside the 3900X and 12700K, so a great result here, as it was also just 10% slower than the 12-core 5900X. Therefore, when compared to its predecessor, the 5800X, the 7700X is an impressive 27% faster. The Corona benchmark results were also impressive, as here the 7700X nudged ahead of the 3900X, 10900K, and even beat the 5800X by a 21% margin. Disappointingly, however, it was 7% slower than the 12700K. Certainly not a massive margin, but given they both cost $400 US, you'd hope AMD could have beaten what is essentially a one-year-old competitor at this point. We've seen the 7950X dominate the Premiere Pro benchmark previously, and here we can see that the 7700X is just as impressive, beating the 5950X by a 10% margin and crushing the 12700K by an almost 40% margin. The Photoshop results are also highly impressive. Here the 7700X was 19% faster than the 12700K and 28% faster than the 5800X. This made it the fastest CPU we've ever tested, as it managed to beat even the 7950X. The 7700X also performed well in After Effects, though it wasn't quite as dominant. Still, it did nudge ahead of the 12700K, albeit by a mere 3% margin, but that's better than some of the productivity results we've seen. This also meant it was much faster than the 5800X, offering a little over 30% greater performance. The last productivity benchmark we're going to look at is code compilation performance, and here the 7700X again does well, basically matching the 12700K, depending on the memory configuration used by the Alder Lake CPU. An impressive result overall, given that it was 8% faster than the 5900X and a massive 50% faster than the 5800X. Now, time for the gaming benchmarks, and we'll start with Factorio, which is very cache sensitive and really only looks at single core performance. The 7700X slots in right between the 7600X and 7950X, making it one of the fastest CPUs we've tested in Factorio, at around 6% faster than the 12700K. So a solid result overall, despite getting crushed by the 5800X 3D by a whopping 45% margin. It's really going to take the 3D V-Cache versions of these Zen 4 processors to top the 5800X 3D in this title. Moving on to Watch Dogs Legion, here the 7700X was mighty impressive, jumping ahead of the 7600X by a 10% margin and even edged out the 7950X. This placed it roughly on par with the 1200K using DDR5 memory and a massive 30% ahead of the 5800X. It's rare and almost unheard of to see a single CPU generation boost gaming performance by this much, especially given Zen 3 was certainly no slouch. Next we have Rainbow Six Extraction, and like the previously tested Zen 4 CPUs, the 7700X, it's not amazing here. That said, while this more middle of the pack type result looks quite poor, it is well worth noting that the 7700X was just 3% slower than the fastest CPU tested, the 12900K using DDR5 memory, so overall, certainly not a bad result. The 7950X and the 7600X results were already very impressive in Hitman 3, and with the 7700X we're getting more of the same, as it nudged ahead by just a few frames. This did, however, mean that the 7700X was 7% faster than the 12700K using DDR5 memory. Not a massive win, but it was impressive to see the Zen 4 CPU coming out on top. Now, Tiny Tina's Wonderlands has been included, not because it's a super CPU demanding game, but rather because it's a good representation of how CPU demanding many modern games are. And that is to say, when using a relatively modern CPU, most games are going to end up being GPU bound, even when using an RTX 3080 Ti at 1080p, as we see in this example. The game can be useful for testing lower end CPUs, but for the 7700X it just shows that we're able to max out the RTX 3090 Ti here, matching other high end CPUs.
Fiyat performans sistem var. Hazır mısın?
Teknoloji konusunda bu en çok konuştuğumuz şey AI. Hayatımız içinde var, telefonda kullanıyoruz veya başka soru cevaplar için kullanıyoruz, yemek yapmak için bile kullanıyoruz. Ama bu AI'yi nasıl geliştirebiliriz veya ne ürünler için kullanabiliriz? Bunlar asıl sorular olması lazım. Teknoloji kanalı olarak böyle bir imkan verildiği için zaten çok sevinçliyim, çünkü elimde müthiş bir cihaz var. Asus'un Ascend'i var elimde ve bu cihazın içinde 128 GB hafıza var. 128 GB. Sizin RAM'leriniz şu anda benim elimde. Ve bu RAM'ler ne işe yarıyor? Bu cihaz ne işe yarıyor? Bu videoda bunu anlatacağız. Ama ondan önce zaten AI konusunda ben konularda uzman değilim ama uzman olduğunu bileyim. Alican Kiraz var. Alican Kiraz'la bu videonun devamında bir röportaj yapacağız. Sadece röportaj değil, genel geçer bir hani AI konusunda bir şey. Bu konuda bilgilenmek isterseniz o kısmına da atlayabilirsiniz. Ama ilk önce bu cihazdan bahsedelim. İlk önce dışından başlayalım. Minicik bir kutu. Minicik bir kutu derken gerçekten minicik bir kutu. İlk önce atısından bahsedelim. Bunların atası DGX-1 dediğimiz bir ünite. İlk AI ünitelerinden birisiydi ve Sam Altman'a, OpenAI'dan tanınır. Sam Altman'a Jensen tarafından, Nvidia'nın kurucusu olan Jensen tarafından verilmişti. Ama devasa bir server rackiydi. Server ünitesiydi yani. O boyuttan buraya gelmemiz gerçekten muhteşem bir şey. Isı konusunu konuşacağız. Çözülmüş bir noktaya kadar diyorum ama. Ve bunun içinde Grace Blackwell GB10 ünitesi var. Bu ne demek? CUDA çekirdeğini kullanabiliyorsunuz. Aynı zamanda Nvidia'da yazılan PyTorch'un birçok özelliğini de kullanabiliyorsunuz. İçinde hiç direkt yüklü geliyor. Ama asıl önemli kısımlardan birisi. Bunun içindeki işlemcinin içinde Unified Memory dediğimiz bütünleşik bir hafıza var. Bu ne işe yarıyor? Hem CPU hem GPU aynı anda o 128 GB, evet 128 GB RAM'in hepsini kullanabiliyor. Bu ne işe yarıyor bileşik hafıza olması? Hem GPU hem CPU aynı hafıza noktalarını kullanabiliyor ve bu sayede siz isterseniz GPU isterseniz CPU tarafına hafızanızı ayırabiliyorsunuz. Özellikle AI ünitelerinde inanılmaz işe yarayacak bir şey. 10 gigabit Ethernet portumuz var. Bu çok önemli. Çünkü hızlı data aktarmamız lazım. Arka tarafta USB-C girişlerimiz var. Bazıları Thunderbolt olması da data aktarımı için, yüksek hızlı data aktarımı için çok önemli. Ve burada bazılarınızın tanıyamadığı bir konektör var. O da NVLink. NVLink, Nvidia'nın kendi geliştirdiği bir bağlantı konektörü. Bu konektör sayesinde iki farklı veya daha da fazla üniteyi birbirine bağladığınızda paylaşabiliyorsunuz hafızalarını. Hafızanı paylaşmak ne demek? Sadece hafıza değil, güçlerini de paylaşabiliyorsunuz. Ve bunun sayesinde bütün bir modeli, mesela 128 GB'a sığmayan bir modeliniz var. 256 GB yapabiliyorsunuz. Daha da 512 de yapabilirsiniz. Gittikçe arttırabiliyorsunuz ve tek bir üniteymiş gibi çalışıyor bu NVLink sayesinde. Bunun en güzel kısmı bu arada övmem gereken bir playbook var. Bu playbook'u bu cihaza sahip olmasanız bile kesinlikle AI ile ilgileniyorsanız bakmanızı öneririm. Çünkü Nvidia'nın playbook'u sayesinde birçok özellikle işte VS Code'a nasıl vibe coding yapılabilir, dashboard'u nasıl kurabiliriz veya Docker sistemiyle config UI'yi nasıl kurabilirim, PyTorch'u nasıl kurabilirim gibi şeyleri çok daha basit anlatmışlar ve kendi konteynerları hazırlamışlar. Tek yapmanız gereken okumak bir kısmını, hatta okumada copy paste bile yapabilirsiniz ama anlayabilmek için okumak lazım. O yüzden hani yeni alan birisinin bunu direkt çalıştır bir seviyesinde çalıştırması çok kolaylaşmış Nvidia tarafından. Bunu da çok beğendim açıkçası özellik olarak. Bu zaten ön inceleme gibi bir şeydi. Alican Kiraz'la AI konusunda zaten kendisi muazzam güzel bir konuşma yaptık. O kısma geçelim. O kısımda Alican bize hem bu cihazı daha kendi ne için kullandığını anlatacak hem de biraz cihazın daha detaylarına ineceğiz. Şimdi onun evine doğru zıplıyorum ben. Aynı zamanda işte bakalım oyun açıyorum.
Arkadaşlar dediğim gibi asıl önemli olan kısma geldik. Çünkü ben burada bilmiyorum. Alican biliyor. Alican biraz biliyor. Twitter'ınızda zaten önere kesinlikle düşmüştür müthiş projeleriyle. Sen ne düşünüyorsun? Bunu sen bayağı kurcaladın. Benim gibi bir aydır kurcalıyoruz açıkçası bu cihazı. Ne düşünüyorsun sence? Nasıl bir cihaz?
Ama cidden şey yani son kullanıcıya ulaştırabilecek en güzel cihazlardan biri olmuş aslında. Çünkü yani cidden bu VLAN boyutlarına ulaşmak çok zor. Hani ekran kartı olarak da mesela hani benzeri işte ne yapılabilir? İşte 48 GB 2 tane kart alınabilir. Yine Nvidia'dan falan bakıldığında onlar da çok yüksek maliyetli oluyor. Bir de kasayı düşmen gerekecek, kasayı halledeceksin.
Power supply, yanması.
O nedenle yani hem tükettiği güç hem de böyle 7/24 çalışabilecek bir sistem olarak bence çok güzel dizayn edilmiş.
Evet. Başka 128 GB bir RAM'lik farklı ürünler de var. Bunun parladığı bence yer iki şey. Bir, image generation veya şeylerde. İki, fine tuning. Fine tuning'i sen bize anlat istiyorum çünkü sen deneyimlisin.
Evet,
bunda sen daha bilgilisin daha doğrusu. Fine tuning tam ne ve hani neden bunda mesela daha iyi çalışıyor?
Çok doğru abi. Abi orada şöyle düşünebiliriz. Mesela özellikle hani LLM'ler şu anda mesela generate edilip yani oluşturulurken aslında internet veri tabanındaki bütün bilgilerle oluşturuluyor. Evet. Mesela işte atıyorum X LLM'i, Llama veya işte Küven. Bunlardan biri mesela oluşturulacağı zaman ilgili o zaman dilimindeki internetteki bütün açık kaynak dataları crawl ediyorlar. Tabii ki hani burada Apache veya MRT lisansı falan olayları da var.
Evet.
Ona göre yapıldıktan sonra ona train ediliyor. Train edildiği zaman da abi bu genel hani bütün o datanın ortak bir şey çıkarıldığı için o LLM'ler bir alanda uzman olmuyor. Ben mesela abi o aynı sene de konuşuyoruz mesela oyun üzerine belki de bir LLM mesela fine tune edildiği zaman işte oyun asistanı olsun, bana yardım etsin, bir oyuncu gözüyle baksın diye. Mesela onun için ekstradan abi senin bir hazırladığın bir datasetle eğitmen gerekiyor. Onu fine tune ettiğin zaman da o artık yapmaya başlıyor. Ben bu alana dedike bir LLM'im ve bu alana dedike konuşabiliyorum deyip bu alana yönelebiliyor. Aynı zamanda görüntüyü mesela işleyenler de öyle. Mesela diyelim ki hani benim videolarda da görmüşsünüz. Yani arabalarımız detect ediyor. İşte siz çok fazla bir arabanın mesela resmini, görselini verip ona derseniz ki bak bu araba işte sedanmış, bu araba işte kamyondur derseniz o fine tune sonrasında model artık o seçtiği, gördüğü, segmente ettiği cismi onu adlandırmasını çok daha kolaylaştırabiliyor.
Evet, daha hızlanıyor.
Aynen, kesinlikle abi. Mesela hani oldu ki her ülkeden ülkeye bazı araçlar değişebiliyor ya abi. Mesela oldu, sen mesela kamerayı buraya koyduk, çektik. Gece vakti çektik mesela. Araçları da çok güzel classified ettik, yükledik. Artık o elenen geceye yönelik araçları çok daha rahat bulabiliyor.
Tabii.
Onun gibi böyle yani biraz daha el eleme aslında yapıyoruz.
Özelleştirme.
Kesinlikle abi. Aynen, tam
Aynen
özelleştiriyoruz orada.
Ki işte burada da onu yaparken 128 GB VRAM'in bir faydasını sağlıyorsun.
çok
Çünkü orada toplu bir şekilde yaptığın için bütün modeli yüklemen gerekiyor.
Evet.
Bütün modeli yükleyip detaylandırdığın zaman zaten asıl fine tuning'i
Çok
iyi olmasının sebebi bu cihazın bu.
Kesinlikle.
Aynı zamanda bir de şey de konuşmuştuk seninle tam bundan önce. Özellikle bu scale up dediğimiz, yani bir proje yaptığında veya lokalde kalmak istediğinde de bazı şeylerde şimdi bu H200 alabiliyoruz. Evet, bunları serverlardan kiralayabiliyoruz. Yapabiliyoruz. Ama şimdi sen bunu yapmadan önce projenin tutabileceğini, olup olmayacağını test etmen lazım.
çok doğru.
Bu tür durumlarda 5 tane H200 tutmak yerine, satın almak yerine bu tür cihazda lokalde yapıp bu ürün yapabiliyor mu? Bunu mesela hani fine tune'ladığımda küçük bir noktada ben bunun bir bonusunu görebiliyor muyum diye test yapmam lazım. Bu testlerde bu çok iyi çalışıyor. Çünkü yaptıktan sonra zaten aynı alt mimari olduğu için Spark OS dediğimiz şey hani aynı mimari, sen bunu ondan sonra alıp internetteki cloud'daki veri tabanı dümdüz copy paste hop diye gönderip bir anda H200, yani 10 tane H200, 20 tane H200 veya 200 tane H200'de çalıştırabiliyorsun. En büyük yani development kit olmasının sebeplerinden birisi de hani o tür şeylerde de o. Bir de lokal.
Evet,
aslında onu dedim.
Aynen doğru.
O kısımda aynen private dediğimiz mesela bazı şirketler oluyor tabii ki de, özellikle finans şirketleri. Tam burada hani finans şirketlerinin de ortasındayız. Datayı içeride saklamak istiyor veya dediğim gibi fine tune'lamak istediği, yani böyle o datayı analiz etmek istiyor ama kendi müşterisinin datası, bunu dışarıya veremez veya kendi özel datası müşteri olmasa bile.
Çok doğru.
O durumlarda şimdi 200 tane H200 alıp server kurmak sıraya girmek demek.
Aynen.
2 sene sonra gelecek belki o, ama senin hemen şimdi ihtiyacın var veya küçük noktada ihtiyacın var. O noktada mesela bu çok iyi devreye giriyor bence.
Doğru
çünkü
abi.
işte lokalde 128 GB hızlı olmasa da işi görebiliyor.
Kesinlikle bu.
Olay mesela işte hız değil, yapabilme.
Onu tamamlayabilme çok doğru. Ve
Evet.
küçük güç de tamamlıyor. O çok güzel abi.
Evet.
Vesile abi, yani seninle de konuşurken hani bahsettiğimiz gibi mesela oldu ki bir H100 aldım mesela. Ki dediğim gibi bulması çok zor ve çok maliyetli.
Bulduğunu varsayalım.
Bulduk. Hani onda bile mesela 80 GB VRAM oluyor. Tabii kompüt gücü çok yüksek. Ama mesela 70'ini en fazla kullanabiliyorsun. Çünkü function yapanlar bilir, hani o sona bıraktığın o 10 GB, 15 GB oluyor abi. Arada bir pikler olduğu zaman OEM yemini yapıyor böyle. O yüzden de hani bu cidden böyle hani 2 tane H100'ün alıp böyle kullanabileceğin bir sistem eğer böyle yapamıyorsan ve maddi durumun yetmiyorsa, ki çoğu yeri yetmiyor.
Aynen öyle.
Cidden çok güzel bir tercih sebebi oluyor. Ve de çok, yani benim en çok hoşuma giden de CUDA mimarisi.
Evet.
Yani her yer çok destekli. PyTorch çok destekli. İşte diğer yandan kullanacağın TensorFlow'lar çok destekli. Yani kaynak açısından sıkıntı yaşamıyorsun.
Evet.
Ben mesela bir JSON'u aldığımda ilk Nvidia JSON almıştım daha önceden. Onda mesela
Ki bunun bir önceki versiyonu bu JSON. Yani bunun atası diyebiliriz. Yani biraz daha çok düşük versiyon tabii ki de. Yani VRAM olarak kaçtı? 12 veya 8 miydi?
8
bayağı küçük bir şeydi ama bunun da atasıdır. Hani zaten
Kesinlikle
başlangıçta da JSON'ı daha da büyük yaptık. H200 seviyesine çıkardık değil mi? 120 GB koydular VRAM olarak.
çok doğru valla. Onda mesela bir sürekli bir kaynak sıkıntısı falan da yaşıyordum mesela.
Tabii.
Hani ortamı kendin kurman gerekiyordu, yapman gerekiyordu. Gördüm ben mesela nokta abi, bu geldiğinde all-in-one geliyor resmen.
Evet, aynen yani Spark OS ile geliyor.
Aynen.
Kendi içinde yani Nvidia ve hani Asus'lara falan da sağlamış bunu. Tamamen bir işletim sistemi sunuyor. Bu işletim sistemini açtığınızda Docker içinde yüklü. Bu Docker niye önemli? Çünkü bu hani bu tür AI yazılımları, özellikle yeni bir şeyler kurmak istediğinizde paket geliyor. Bunları kurmanız gerekiyor. Docker'ı tamamen kurmuşlar. Kendi web arayüzü var. Bu çok güzel bir web arayüzü. Nvidia Sync çok iyi. Asıl onu övmemiz lazım. Nvidia Sync. Yani siz bu cihazı kurduğunuzda tabii ki HDMI çıkışı var. Bir görüntü alabiliyorsunuz ama gerek yok. Ethernet'le bağladığınızda tamamen bir laptopa veya PC'nizde Nvidia Sync programını yükleyip
statik bir IP verdiğinizde ve vermeden de her seferinde değiştirmek istemiyorsanız statik IP diyorum ama statik IP verdiğinizde dümdüz siz bunu şey yapıyorsunuz ve otomatik olarak isterseniz web yayına, web arayüzüne bağlanabiliyorsunuz. Juniper sen dediğin gibi gösterdin. Juniper'i gösterebiliyorsunuz. Burada yani fazlalar onlarca istediğiniz gibi terminal açabiliyorsunuz ki mecburi oluyor bu bazı durumlarda. Veya siz bu datanın lokalde kalmasını istiyorsanız daha yavaş ama çalışabilen şekilde ve yani 128 GB VRAM'in hepsini kullanıyor büyük data atarsanız ve çalışması güzel işte. Yani yavaş olsa da bu analizi 7/24 çalışabildiği için
kesinlikle.
akşam yapsın ben sabah datamı alayım modunda çalıştım. Ben mesela 12 saatlik kedilerimin salonda kaos yapmasını attım. Dedim ki kedilerimin hangisi kaç kere salona geldi?
Çok iyi.
Yani bu salakça bir use case ama yapabiliyor olması çok güzel. Veya bunun mesela biz Mesut'la konuşmuştuk. Onunla bir tane bir otopark yeri varmış. Bu otopark yerini mesela analizlediğimizde yaptık. Bir tane bölge var. O bölgeyi analizleyecek. O bölgeyi analizlediğinde boşsa yaklaştığı zaman arabası notification gönderecek. Küçük noktalar bunlar. Bunu bu arada daha düşük şeylerde de yapabilirsiniz ama o analizin hızlı yapabilmesi buradaki
kesinlikle
ekstra VRAM'in, o CUDA çekirdeğinin birçok şeyin içerisi. VRAM mesela bu en hızlı değil. Bunu zaten hani Nvidia'nın kendisi de çok söyledi. Ama yüksek VRAM fine tune'da, image generation'da, video generation'da, videoda tam yeterli ne yazık ki değil büyük videolar için ama bazı şeyler için video araştırmada ve transkripte. O da çok enteresan.
Çok iyi abi.
Sizin hani videolarınızı veya herhangi bir şeyin transkripte veya PDF'leri büyük yazı dosyalarını analiz etmede de çok başarılı.
Çok doğru o da.
O da işte 128 GB VRAM'in artısı özellikle.
Direkt oraya harbiden sığabiliyor yani o çok iyi. Mesela bir şey dediğin gibi translate konularını mesela yapılabiliyor. Açık kaynak modellerden birkaçı kurulabilir. Mesela Meta'nın var böyle onun directional ne ismiydi? O olabilir veya işte Whisperer olabilir OpenAI'nin. Bunları kurduğun anda abi yapabiliyorsun hani. Çok rahat kaldırırsın. Hatta fine tune edersin.
Evet.
Kendin de kullanırsın böyle. Ve kapalı devre olur.
Aynen sen mesela de yapmıştın bana onu gösterdin. GPT'nin OSS'ini kurmuştun.
Evet aynen.
Onu aynı zamanda tool'lu versiyon. Tool dediğimizde bir vibe coding yani bir kodlama genere ettiğinizde dümdüz kodlama genere edebiliyorsunuz. Ama sizin kodunuzu araştırıp analiz etme kısmında tooling kısmı önemli. Bunun tooling'ini ayarlayabiliyorsunuz ve tooling'ini ayarladığınızda dediğim gibi işte sen mesela oyun yazılımına fine tuning edildiğinde veya senin yaptığın gibi sen mesela özellikle bu projelerini de aşağıda bırakacağım bakabilirsiniz. Cyber security konusunda.
Evet abi çok doğru.
O fine tune'larda sen bunu işte GPT OS'si fine tune'layıp bunun içine lokalde koyup dışarıya expose etmeden bunun üzerinde test edebilirsin.
O çok kritik cidden. Özellikle hani küçük böyle hani orta ölçü hatta büyük ölçekli şirket bile diyebilir. Çünkü yani bizim en büyük sıkıntımız ülkece olarak hani H100'leri veya H200'leri
evet. Veya datanın dışarı gitmemesi.
Kesinlikle.
Yani o da var. Yani Türkiye içinde tutmamız gereken datalar var.
Evet abi.
Onu tutmak istediğin için yani H200 bulana kadar bunda yapabilirsin.
Evet.
Ya bulma hani bekleyeceksin ya da hani etkili olmayacak şekilde binlerce pro versiyonu alacaksın. O kısım da var ki bazı noktalarda o da hız olarak daha etkili olabiliyor. Orada şeye bakman lazım işte hani maliyetli hız mı ne önemli kısmına bakıyorsun ama bu hani fiyatı yüksek olsa da çünkü yüksek bir fiyat var ama getiri iş şirket için veya bu tür şeylerde hani getiri sağlayabilecek durumlar için ucuz bir ürün.
Kesinlikle.
Özellikle cloud ücretlerini konuşmak istemem. H200 ve H100'ün A serisinin bile pahalı.
Çok korkunç.
Ve
bulunmuyor yani.
Bir de çalıştığı sürece yapıyor. Yani toplam aylık almıyorsun bunun kiralayı. Yaktığın kadar alıyorsun ve yakıyorsun. 7/24 yakıyorsun.
Kesinlikle.
Sen peki bunun evde neden kullanacaksın? Hani uzun vadede neler? Çünkü benim aklımda var birkaç tane proje evde neden kullanacağımdan.
Evet. Ama ben de valla düşünüyorum şu anda. Özellikle hani robotik taraflarına böyle bir şey yapmak istiyorum. İşte robot koluna bir bağlayacağım. Bir de bir derinlik kamerası şu anda böyle bir bakıyorum. Onu da alıp mesela yani normalde işte arkada böyle tamamen DGX çalışacak orada. Spark. O sırada da benim robotum belli verdiğim taskları halletmeye çalışacak. Bir de Nvidia'nın var abi. Isaac'i var.
Evet.
Bu tamamen böyle cloud'da eğitim için kullanabilecek bir platform. Yanlış hatırlamıyorsam böyle ücretsiz versiyonları da var. Yani GitHub'da falan.
Evet.
Onu da alıp bunun üzerine çalıştırıp hani robotu simüle ettirmeye çalışacağım. Yani binlerce hareketi veya binlerce işlevi nasıl yapabilecek?
Otomasyon robotu yapıp.
Kesinlikle vallahi.
Aslında tavana direkt de bağlayıp, rail'de bağlayıp kendini kontrol et tamamen o noktaya. Çünkü yapılabilir. Evet mantık çok. Özellikle kamerayla kamera analizini çünkü hızlı yapabiliyor.
Çok doğru tabii.
Onunla beraber birleştirebilirsin. Ben de dediğim gibi biraz daha hani ev asistanı kısmını AI kısmına çevirmek istiyorum.
Kesinlikle.
Özellikle hani dışarıdan gelen kişilerin analizleri şey yapması, güvenlik konusu var. Aynı zamanda dediğin gibi özellikle kendi yazdığım kodların
Tabii.
daha fine tune'layıp benim gibi yaz
Evet abi.
veya benim gibi düşün.
Evet, çok
O
doğru.
kısım daha farklı. O kısımlarda en azından kendim eğitebileceğim şeyler var. Özellikle bizim dediğim gibi arabanın datasını
Evet.
analizleme
Çok iyi
kısmı
yapmışsın,
çok iyi var. Hani
aynen.
Tesla'da özellikle arabanın kendi datasını indirebiliyorsunuz.
Tabii.
Ben indirdim daha sonra. Çünkü Elon Musk oluyor, ben de alayım bari dedim datamı ve hani 2,5 yıllık data var. Burada ben hani cloud'a yani başka bir firmaya expose etmektense datayı bunun içinde direkt analiz ettirebilecek bir şey ki dediğim gibi PDF ve text analizinde de çok başarılı.
Tabii.
Bunu da kullanacağım ben de.
Valla çok doğru abi. Bir de şey de çok güzel abi. Özellikle iki tanesini böyle klasalamak da çok iyi oluyor.
Evet,
O da çok
asıl o kısım burada zaten hani videoda da gösterdik. O kısımda arka tarafta Ethernet dışında Nvidia'nın kendi ki Nvidia'nın en büyük network
CX'de
şeylerinden
aynen. Doğru.
ayrı bir girişi var. Bu sayede üst üste stackleyebiliyorsunuz.
Evet o çok iyi ya.
Ve bunun
Özellikle o-
switch'ini alırsanız evet yani direkt bütün ünite tek bir üniteymiş gibi. Hani 128 üzerine bir tane daha biz buna koyduğumuz anda 256 GB VRAM'miş gibi düşünüyor. Siz bir ayar yapmak zorunda değilsiniz bunun için. Bu form faktörde gelmesi çok iyi.
Evet abi bu düşük yani watt'ta olması ve yani böyle kompakt olması
Evet.
çok ilgi çekici.
Kullanıcı için
Evet.
ya o yüzden bazı noktalarda tabii ki de şey değil. Hani her şeyi çözen bir ürün değil. Herkes için de bir ürün değil.
Evet, doğru,
Ama
doğru.
spesifik kişi için hani ben bunu fine tune'lamak istiyorum. Ne olduğunu biliyorum. Veya öğrenmek istiyorum diyen için biraz pahalı bence bir ürün. Hani
doğru,
daha
doğru.
ucuz bir şeyden de başlayabilir.
Kesinlikle.
Yüksek gigabaytlı VRAM'li bir şeyden de başlayabilir ama bu hani full paket gelmesi, üzerinde kurulu gelmesi, kaynakları sunması bayağı bir artı olmuş.
Evet.
Güzel bir ürün
Çok
olarak
doğru.
başlamışlar yani.
Bir de klasik bir daha galiba bizim ülkemizden de aynı şey oldu. Hani vergiler falan derken. Çünkü yurt dışı fiyatı cidden uygun.
Linux kullanması da büyük bir artı o konuda.
çok
Linux
güzel
kullandığı
eğitici
için
bir şey de var.
o konuda da özellikle arkada çalışan servisler olabildiğince limitlemiş Nvidia kendi Spark OS'inde. Çok limitlediği için çok az bir overhead'i var. Yani işlem sisteminin harcadığı RAM sayısı çok az. Bu sayede geri kalan hepsi bütün sizin model eğitmenize bilmem neyse bu tür şeylerinize kalıyor. Idle'ında ben 3 GB'ın altına indim bazı noktalarda.
Evet.
Tabii bazı şeyleri kapatmak gerekiyor. Her şeyi açtığında idle hani boşken 12 falan gördüm galiba ama
evet, düşen.
bir
Ben de o
boşalttığında
civarlarda gördüm.
3'e düştüm. Yani
Evet.
daha da biraz zorlasam daha da düşürürsün bu arada.
Çok iyi.
Çeksin ama o kadar da düşmeyelim. O kadar da kurcalamayalım. O noktada biraz da
Aynen.
arkadan başka bir şey ekleyeceğiz.
Aynen öyle. Özellikle şeyi de çok sevdim. Hani şu anda hep böyle bir çılgınlık var ya. Type-C'den hem görüntü hem ses her şeyi aktaralım.
Evet.
Ayrı HDMI olması da çok hoşuma gitti orada.
Ya
Tam da modları da boşta bırak.
koymayabilirlerdi. Ben de onu düşündüm. Acaba gelecek mi? Çünkü monitöründe USB-C yok benim. Eski bir monitör. O yüzden böyle şey yaptım acaba. Adaptörümü almam gerekiyor.
Değil mi?
USB-C'den DVI, DisplayPort alayım falan. Yok direkt HDMI geliyor. Bağlamak istersiniz ama bağlamak zorunda değilsiniz. Onu da
Evet,
söyleyelim.
o çok iyi.
Hani
Doğru.
hiç bağlamadan da bütün
köşede kalsın
setup'ı
öyle.
bütün setup'ı yapabiliyorsunuz. Hani DJ bu Nvidia Sync dediğimiz yazılım bunu destekliyor. Hani siz bunu alıp hiç klavye mouse takmadan tamamen bütün setup'ı şey üzerinden, Ethernet üzerinden, SSH üzerinden halledebiliyorsunuz. O şekilde hani kutudan çıktığında
Kesinlikle.
hazır bir şekilde hazırlamışlar. O da bence önemli. Çünkü ben ilk yüklediğimde bize beta versiyonu gelmişti.
Tabii.
Bir Docker bir böyle yaptı bende.
Aynen.
Sonra düzelttim yani. Sonraki hemen çok hızlı update geldi. Ben bunun feedback'ini verdim. Bir gün içinde düzelttiler. Geldi direkt. O da çok önemli. Mesela Nvidia forumunda bu tür şeyleri soranlara çok hızlı cevap veriyorlar.
Evet, o çok
Onu da
iyi.
kullanmak lazım. Ben normalde çok forum eskisi gibi değilim forum konusunda. Eskiden daha böyle forumcuydum böyle hani aktif bir şey community'de vardım. Burada mesela şey dedim direkt foruma gideyim yazdım. Cevap geldi. Sonraki gün hotfix geldi. Update'i yaptım ve düzeldi. Hemen arada
Çok
düzelttim.
önemli bir ürün için.
Bunu hani
Evet.
alanlar büyük ihtimalle zaten o Docker'ın nasıl ayarlanacağını, kendi nasıl yükleyeceğini bilen insanlar zaten.
Doğru kesinlikle.
Yine de kutu içinde bu kadar rahat gelmesi
Yani
çok
user
büyük bir
friendly
artı.
olması harika bir şey. Kesinlikle.
Aynen öyle. Ben çok beğendim açıkçası. Aslında
Ben
biraz daha
de.
hani senin bunda neler kurcalayacağını çok merak ediyorum uzun vadede.
Aynen.
Tekrardan dediğim gibi Alican'ın içeriklerine bakmak için Twitter ve
teşekkür
LinkedIn'i
ederim.
aşağıya da bırakıyoruz. Kendisi AI konusunda gerçekten her insanı şaşırtmaya devam ediyor.
Bir tanesi.
Çok da
Çok güzel
yani
gördüm,
şey
çok
yapıyoruz.
teşekkür ederim.
Eğleniyorum ben
Onur
açıkçası
oldum
Twitter'da
vallahi.
görünce böyle şey yapıyorum. Yeni bir şey yapmış öyle. Yeni bir proje geliyor galiba diye.
Bir tanesi. Çok teşekkür
Çok mutlu ediyor. Kendisine teşekkür ediyoruz geldiği için bu
Ben
konularda.
teşekkür ederim.
yaptı.
Estağfurullah.
Damladık
İyi
son
ki
anda
geldin.
kapıyı çaldım çünkü.
Ben de iyi ki geldim valla. Her zaman beklerim.
Bu projeler başkasının yaptığını görünce bir anda şey yapıyorsun. Ben de
Değil mi?
böyle bir şey
Doğru.
yapabilirim diyorsun. Ve
Evet
bunlar
abi.
için böyle Buna da ihtiyacınız yok. Bu evet büyük bir artı ama daha küçük şeylerde başlayıp
Tabii, kesinlikle.
yavaşça büyüyebilen projeler de yapabilirsiniz. Ekran kartlarınız da bunun için yeterli.
Tabii, çok
Evinizdeki.
doğru.
Tabii ki de bu daha hızlı yapıyor. Daha büyük modelleri yapıyor ama her şey var. Bir şeyin başlangıcı lazım.
Küçük setler abi kesinlikle. İlk başta mesela evindeki bilgisayarındaki işte atıyorum 8 GB'lık, 4 GB'lık, 6 GB'lık bir ekran kartıyla başlayınca zaten şey olacak hani. Belki hani oradan bir şey kazanacaksın. Belki proje yapacaksın, bir şey olacak. Daha sonra ileriki aşamalarda hani böyle state of art tarzında bir cihaza ulaştığında da yani bunu da inşallah böyle sonuna kadar kullanacaksındır o zaman.
Evet.
Bir de bu arada abi şey de çok doğru. Hani direkt mesela hani bunu aldığın zaten hani cihaz her şeyde çok rahat. Yani direkt hani bir şeyler yapıp edebilirsin ama arkadaki o background'unu hazırlamak da çok önemli.
Tabii.
AI kısmına bakayım, araştırayım, LLM'le AI nasıl çalışıyor falan gibi. Onları dizayn edip tabii o bilgin de olduğu zaman aldığında
O zaman açılıyor. Asıl aynen.
Kesinlikle.
O yüzden ben mesela Alican'a geldiğimde hiç şey sordum. Sen ne yapıyorsun dedim. Çünkü hani ben tamam evet belli bir şey kurcaladım ama içinin tamamen detayını bilen, fine tuning'i bilen insanın şeyi daha farklı oluyor. Deneyimi özellikle hani limitlerini de görüyorsun. Bir de bu ürünlerin de limitleri var. Belli bir duvarları var. O limitleri de bilmek de şey oluyor. Yani bu ürün ne işe yarıyor, ne için kullanılır
Doğru.
kısmını da çok güzel cevaplıyor. Çünkü her ürünün de bir limitasyonu vardır. O yüzden o limitasyonu bildiğinde o aletin ne kadar zorlayabileceğini ve kime önereceğini de bilirsin. Ben o yüzden mesela ben kendi evet fikrim vardı buraya gelmeden önce ama şey yapmak da istedim. Bu fikir doğru fikir mi? Aslında onu şey yapmıştım ama
Senin analizlerin o konuda efsane var.
vallahi şey yaptık. Güzel bir ürün oldu. Güzel bir şey oldu. Kendisine çok teşekkür ediyorum. Geldi. Şey yaptığı için, videomuzu teşrif ettiği için. Ben o zaman oyun yüklüyorum buna.
Cansın.
Oyun çalışıyor. Pet Racing'de Cyberpunk'a 60 FPS'i görebildim. Tabii ki de 1080p'de, medium ayarlarda, frame generation açık bir şekilde. Ama Pet Racing'le onu kapatırsanız güzel bir şekilde de oynayabiliyorsunuz. Pet Racing frame generation kapatıp da yapabiliyorsunuz. Medium ayarlarda veya 1080p 4K. Crysis çalışıyor. Bunu yapmanız gereken şeylerden birisi de FX dediğimiz altyapıyı kurmak. Hatta şu anda gösterdiğim gibi FX'i kurduğunuz zaman ben bu zaten FX'i kurmuştum. FX Steam'in de destek olduğu aynı zamanda bir altyapısı. ERM64 altyapısını kullanıyor. Onu x86'ya çeviriyor. Eğer FX üzerinden Steam'i koyarsanız ve bazı Nvidia'nın Linux driverlarını kurduğunuz durumda zaten içinde bir driverla geliyor. Fakat oyun driverlarını da kurduğunuz takdirde ve DLSS kütüphanelerinde sistem linklerini bağladığınız zaman inanılmaz aptalca bir şey yapmanıza gerek yok. Ama bu durumda oyunu çalıştırabiliyorsunuz. Oyun çalıştırmak için tabii ki de birkaç ayar lazım. Launcher skip ayarını yapmanız lazım. Veya compatibility'den Proton özelliklerini kullanmanız lazım. Ama bunları yaptığınız takdirde şimdi ekranda gördüğünüz gibi inanılmaz iyi değerler alabiliyorsunuz. Ben şu anda yani bunu oynarken inanılmaz şok oldum. Yani bu değerlere şok oldum. Bu mesela Pet Racing'de. Pet Racing'de tabii ki de oyun tarafında biraz görsellerde, ışıklandırmalarda batırabiliyor. Bu mesela Pet Racing Frame Generation hali. Işıklandırmaları görüyorsunuz kaos halinde. Pet Racing'i kapadığımız durumda bu kadar net görüntü alabiliyoruz. Bu 60 FPS'in üstü bu arada çok rahat bir görüntü var. Oynanabilir bir görüntü var. Tabii ki de bu cihaz oyun cihazı değil. Oyun oynamak için yapılan bir şey değil. Oyun oynamanın da bunda bir mantığı yok. Ama çalışıyor mu? Evet çalışıyor. Devasa bir Nvidia GPU'su çünkü bu. Onun dışında tabii ki de en büyük testimiz bu cihaz Crysis açar mı testiydi. Crysis açarken yine Proton'umuzu kullandık. Proton 10.0.3'ü kullanabildim. Vulkan şeyi var zaten, shader'ları var. Grafik olarak da bunda kendisi SMA 1TX'e geldi. Orta ayarlar DLSS kalite ama 4K'da, bunu 1080p'de oynamadım. 4K'da oynadım direkt. Stabil bir FPS var. 60 değil büyük ihtimalle. Arada tabii ki de gördüğünüz üzere kesintiler oluyor. VSync açsam büyük ihtimalle düzelecekti ama Crysis açar mı sorusunun cevabı evet olan bir AI süper PC ile karşı karşıyayız. Bu segment aslında videonun eğlenceli olan kısmıydı. Biraz daha böyle şey yapmak istiyordum. Hani hayır açmıyor falan demek istiyordum ama gecenin 3'ünde çekiyorum çünkü bunu. Çözülebiliyor. İsterseniz yeteri kadar zorlarsanız biraz zor ama hani bu tür şeyleri denemek isterseniz ulaşabilirsiniz. Size kodları da bas.
Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are revisiting the Ryzen 5 7600X by taking a look at one of the biggest points of contention with these new Zen 4 CPUs, the operating temperature, which is typically up around 95 degrees. Now, AMD has explained that this is by design and is intended but that hasn't stopped the internet from drawing its own conclusions and assumptions. Now, I've heard and read countless different takes on this topic, and the one I wanted to hone in on with this content was the genuine concern that using anything less than a 360mm liquid cooler on the 7600X would see a significant performance loss. And after all, despite using the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler, our 7600X still peaked at 93 degrees for an all-core workload, and that's an insane temperature for a 6-core CPU using a 360mm AIO. So based on that, it's not crazy to assume that when using an affordable air cooler, performance will tank due to thermal throttling, which sees a reduction in the operating frequency. So shortly after completing my 7600X review, I decided to do some testing, and while I have significantly more Zen 4 cooler testing planned, this is an appetizer, or a for science type test, if you will. I decided that it might be entertaining to throw AMD's older Wraithspire box cooler on the 7600X, just to see how poorly it would run, and I have to say the results are extremely surprising and not at all what I was expecting. And around the same time that I was trying to burn up my 7600X with AMD's box cooler, there was a lot of talk floating around the internet of AMD's Eco Mode, as well as the PBO2 curve optimizer with a negative voltage. So I expanded the scope of the testing to look at not just how the 7600X behaved with the AMD box cooler, but also how the 65-watt Eco Mode worked, as well as the PBO2 curve optimizer. And I did this testing with both the box cooler and the 360mm liquid cooler. As usual, we have quite a bit of data to go over, but before we do that, let's talk about the Eco Mode and PBO2. AMD's Eco Mode simply enforces a power limit, so rather than let the 7600X run at full power, which we observed as 86 watts for the cores, it limits the core power to 65 watts, so a rather substantial 24% drop in power there. Now, this certainly won't improve performance, if anything it'll reduce it, but the hope is it'll only slightly reduce performance while massively reducing thermals. Then we have the PBO2 curve optimizer with a negative voltage, and this can be thought of more as like overclocking, but kind of in the other direction. So that is to say your mileage will vary, and ensuring stability can be not just how the 7600X behaves with the AMD box cooler, voltage, but also how the scaling feature which can either be set to increase or decrease PBO2 from the stock setting. I did this testing to show you how to enable this feature here, at least not in detail. For that, I recommend checking out an excellent video from Ali over at Optimum Tech. It really is a great video that shows the process well, and I'll link it below. Now, in the case of Zen 4, you do want to reduce the voltage as these CPUs are thermally limited, not power limited, which we observed lowering the voltage reduces the cores and therefore buys you more frequency headroom. This, however, can and likely will introduce stability issues there, as the CPU doesn't always have enough voltage for the target frequency. And adding another layer of complexity is the fact that not all silicon is equal. For example, what my 7600X can achieve in terms of undervolting could be wildly different from your CPU if you have one, or most other CPUs. It might be much better, or perhaps it might be much worse. And I guess the point is, at this point in time, it's really impossible to say what the expectation here is. It's also extremely difficult to validate an undervolt, and to do so with any degree of accuracy would take at minimum days of stress testing. For example, my 7600X accepted the maximum undervolt value of negative 30. It loaded straight into Windows without an issue, and I began testing. After an hour of looping Cinebench R23, things looked really good, thermals were down, and the performance had actually improved. Pretty amazing stuff. Gaming also appeared to enjoy a nice performance bump, so things were getting very exciting. But then I tried to run the Blender benchmark, and within minutes the application crashed to desktop, and after several tries I reverted back to the BIOS defaults, and the stability issues went away. So I tried a negative 25 offset, still no joy, negative 20 was no good either, and negative 15 also failed. In fact, it wasn't until I went for a negative 10 offset that the system now appeared completely stable, but I should stress that I'm yet to run multiple different loads for days on end, so I can't say for sure that it is 100% stable. I've since tried all 4 of my Zen 4 CPUs, and none of them are 100% stable using a negative 30 offset. Most will handle Cinebench R23 without an issue, but applications like Blender will crash, and this is on the MSI X670E Ace as well as the Gigabyte X670E Master. So I've tried 2 really high quality boards there and got the same results both times. So based on my limited testing, negative 10 to negative 15 appears achievable, but again, I've not done the appropriate level of stress testing to say for sure that they're 100% stable under all conditions. So going into this, I just wanted to make it very clear that undervolting should very much be viewed in the same light as overclocking. You're running the CPU out of spec, and depending on the silicon quality, your mileage will vary. And just because the configuration appears stable after running some games and benchmarks, it doesn't actually mean it's 100% stable and won't let you down at the most inconvenient of times. And there's also a good reason for why AMD runs these Zen 4 CPUs at the voltages they do. They're not adding excessive voltage just for the sake of it. They know exactly what these CPUs require for maximum stability. Now for testing, I'm using our standard AM5 test system, which is built inside the Be Quiet Silent Base 802. The GeForce RTX 3090 Ti has been used along with 32GB of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory. And for cooling, we have the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler, along with the AMD Wraith Spire, and I'm using the original Spire with the copper slug. Okay, let's get into the results. Starting with the Cinebench R23 multi-core results, let's first compare the stock 105 watt behaviour. Here the 7600X scored 15,204 points, which was shown in our day one review, and now using the Wraith Spire we see a 5% drop in performance to 14,408 points, as the sustained clock frequency dropped by 3%, and the operating temperature increased from 93 degrees up to 101 degrees, which is obviously very hot, but I was shocked to see the all-core performance drop by a mere 5%. So rather than try and cap the processor at 95 degrees, it's allowing the 7600X to exceed 100 degrees to avoid heavy throttling. Now, with Eco Mode enabled, which are the 65 watt results, we see that with the 360mm AIO, the peak operating temperature has dropped by 16 degrees, which is huge, and yet all this cost us was 50 MHz, resulting in a mere 1.5% drop in performance. It also improved the performance with the Wraith Spire, while also reducing the operating temperature by 7 degrees, and now the 7600X is just 4% slower than the review configuration, just 4% slower and a degree warmer while using the box cooler. That is pretty nuts. Now, looking at the undervolt results, we see with the 360mm liquid cooler that things have improved. Not massively, but even with a -10 offset, we're still seeing a 7-degree drop in operating temperature with a 100 MHz boost to the sustained operating frequency, and this did improve performance by roughly 2%. Certainly nothing to write home about when it comes to performance, but the fact that this was achieved while reducing temperatures is very good. It's a similar story with the Wraith Spire box cooler. We're now looking at comparable performance to that of the stock behavior at 105 watts, though temperatures are still up by 5 degrees. So this means for the 7600X, just enabling the Eco mode will provide the best temperature results while not compromising stability, while undervolting will generally improve performance and slightly lower temperatures from the stock configuration. Both are certainly good options, but neither are amazing. They don't drastically improve how the 7600X performs. Meanwhile, the single-core performance is barely affected, moving in either direction from the stock configuration by no more than 1%. So what that means is for the most part, I expect gaming performance should be largely unaffected. Here's a quick look at Blender for those of you interested. I won't break down all of this data again, as the trends are quite similar to what we just saw when looking at Cinebench. What I will say though is when using the Wraith Spire, this will result in about a 4% performance hit. So again, a pretty negligible difference really. And here's a look at total system power usage in Blender. Stock the 7600X pushed the total usage to 226 watts, and with the Wraith Spire that figure came down to 211 watts, as the higher operating temperature saw the operating frequency slightly decrease. Eco mode doesn't make a huge difference here, though we are seeing a 13% reduction in total system usage, which makes sense given the CPU itself saw a 24% reduction. Then with the undervolting, we saw total system usage drop by 7%, but remember the operating frequency, temperature and performance was increased, so it is a net gain here. Now, time for the gaming benchmarks, and starting with Watch Dogs Legion, we see that performance using the Eco mode is basically identical to what we saw stock, so at the very least gamers will want to enable that mode. For the best results though, undervolting does look like the way to go. Using the Wraith Spire, we saw a 3% boost and a 5% boost for the 360mm liquid cooler, so that's a nice gain. It's certainly not massive, but a 5% boost for free while also reducing power and thermals, that's a good result. The Rainbow Six extraction performance was also much the same. This time, at best, we received a 2% boost via undervolting, so not exactly exciting, and again, at the very least, enabling eco mode is the way to go for 7600X owners, and this is certainly true if you're worried about the high operating temperatures of the stock mode. Hitman 3 showed more of the same. Performance for the most part went unchanged between the various configurations. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands was already heavily GPU bound using the 7600X, so no change here, and these results will apply to the vast majority of gaming scenarios. Okay, so rather than talk about every game individually, because I did retest all 12 games, I'll just show you the rest of the results on screen. In short, there's very little difference between these various configurations when gaming, and there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, when gaming, the 7600X generally doesn't come close to reaching the maximum power draw, and in fact, when limited to 65 watts, it will more often than not still be operating below that. And this means, as a result, when gaming, the 7600X won't be pegged at over 90 degrees, like what we see in all-core workloads such as Blender and Cinebench R23. Rather, for the vast majority of the games, the temperatures will be significantly lower, and we'll take a look at that. For example, here's a look at F122, after an hour of looping the built-in benchmark. For the most part, the temperature hovered between 40 to 50 degrees with the occasional and very brief spike into the 60s. Total CPU package power was often in the low 50 watt range, with core power just over 20 watts. So when compared to all core workloads, the power draw and temperatures are significantly lower in F122. Cyberpunk 2077 is much more CPU demanding, and here the package power typically stayed above 80 watts, but even so, temperatures were still miles off the 93 degrees seen in Cinebench R23, typically hovering around 63 degrees with occasional and very brief spikes over 70 degrees. Hitman 3 power usage ranged between 60 to 75 watts for the bulk of our testing, and this resulted in operating temperatures in the range of 50 to 60 degrees, and again, all of these games were left for an hour to heat up the CPU and do their thing. So it's a little bit hotter than F122, but less than Cyberpunk 2077. Spider-Man Remastered, which is another very heavy CPU user, this pushed package power to around 82 watts for an operating temperature of about 60 degrees, so a similar result to what we've seen in Cyberpunk. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands, again, isn't a very CPU demanding game, and here we saw similar behaviour to that of F122. Typically, package power hovered just above 50 watts with operating temperatures ranged between 45 to 50 degrees. And the last game we'll take a look at is Counter-Strike Global Offensive. This isn't a core-heavy game, but it does push the CPU quite hard with hundreds of frames per second, and this saw package power generally around 50 watts for a typical operating temperature of just shy of 50 degrees. So there's a bit to go over here, and I guess we'll start with the eco mode, which is really nothing more than a power limit. It did work quite well with the 7600X, dropping temperatures substantially with a good cooler, and it had almost no impact on performance. How different this will be with the 170 watt models depends on things like power limits, and right now the one-click option in the Ryzen Master software does enforce a 65 watt limit regardless of which model you use, but motherboards are now also getting this feature which you can enable in the BIOS, and I expect there to be a range of power options there. So I'll probably explore that a bit more in the future. A similar method is to just force a hard temperature limit. It's essentially the same thing as eco mode. The power limit is just a bit more dynamic depending on your cooling performance, but overall the results will be similar to that of eco mode. Undervolting with PBO2 is a neat trick, though as I've explained there are a few major caveats here. Firstly, depending on the silicon quality, the results could be great, they could be okay, or they could be very unimpressive. This is not a universally proven method. The other important issue is of course stability. Stress testing to the degree where you can be satisfied that the system is 100% stable under all conditions takes time and experience. And if you simply can't afford crashes, I'd say for most it's just not going to be worth the risk, but of course that will be for you to decide. I think what shocked me the most about this testing was how well the 7600X performed with the Wraith Spire. Sure, the temperatures using the stock configuration were very high, but it worked, and again, performance was great. Then with a little bit of tweaking, or by simply enabling the eco mode, it was very usable. Again, temps were high, but we were now in AMD's safe range. More importantly, this means using an affordable tower style cooler is very possible and will lead to much better results than what we saw with the AMD box cooler. It's also very important to note that the 95-degree results shown for the Zen 4 CPUs are recorded running stressful all-core workloads and really don't apply to a gaming situation. Using the exact same configuration that resulted in a 95-degree temperature in Cinebench R23 saw on average just a 60-degree operating temperature when gaming, and for many games the temperature will be considerably less. Personally, I don't find the higher operating temperatures of Zen 4 CPUs to be all that of a big deal. By monitoring how they behave, it's quite obvious AMD's not lying. Rather, the CPUs are operating as intended, and as process nodes continue to increase in density, I believe this sort of behavior will be normalized. In my opinion, the real issue for Zen 4 are the platform costs, things we've already talked about in our reviews. The CPUs themselves are already quite expensive, but it's the absurd price of AM5 motherboards that really hurts the value, along with the need for expensive premium DDR5 memory. The only good news here being that both issues will almost certainly be solved in time, but for now you're simply best off waiting, and again that was my recommendation in all 4 of my Zen 4 reviews. Anyway, I'm going to get back to testing. There is far too much work on right now, and that's just talking about Zen 4. I still want to provide a detailed cooler guide. I've got X670 motherboards, B650 motherboards, all the VRM testing to be done there, and yeah, well, there's just much more stuff. But before that, we have quite a few GPUs to check out, so make sure you are subscribed for that. You're not going to want to miss it. And if you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Also, we have Patreon, Floatplane. Subscribe to either one of those. You'll get more Hardware Unboxed goodness. It'll give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams with Tim, myself, Q&As, and behind-the-scenes content. Tim has just about moved into his new studio, so he'll start pumping out some content soon, so that'll be good. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time. Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Yesterday we checked out the 6-core Ryzen 5 7600X, and today we are hands-on with the 16-core Ryzen 9 7950X. Of course, the 7700X and 7900X reviews are still coming over the next few days, so make sure you are subscribed for those. We do have boatloads more data for you. Speaking of which, I'll get to the benchmark results as quickly as possible, but before we do, let's go over the 7950X specs. What we have here is a 16-core 32-thread Zen 4 processor that clocks between 4.5 and 5.7 GHz depending on the load. Unlike the 7600X, this time we're getting 2-core complex dies, or CCDs, along with a 6nm I/O die. Now, the additional CCD means the total L3 cache capacity has increased from 32 MB to 64 MB, and there's now a total of 16 MB worth of L2 cache. The TDP has also increased from 105 watts from the single CCD models to a whopping 170 watts. Though do note, due to the fact that we're using the same I/O die, that means the same 28 PCIe 5.0 lanes are supported. Now, quite surprisingly, whereas its predecessor, the 5950X, featured a launch price or MSRP of $800 US, the 7950X has actually been dropped to $700 US, so a 13% discount for what should be a much faster processor. Though I should note that at present, the 5950X can be had for as little as $550, so technically the Zen 4 16-core model is coming in at an almost 30% premium, so given that, it will want to be rather snappy. There's a lot more to go over, but we'll talk about many of the new features and changes as we work through the review. So let's go over the test system specs and then get on with it. I've been busy over the past few weeks updating all of our CPU data, and as a result we have 17 CPUs for comparison, along with the 7600X which we just looked at. For the AM4 platform, I've got a range of Zen 2 and Zen 3 CPUs with popular models such as the AMD Ryzen 5 3600, AMD Ryzen 7 3700X, and of course the AMD Ryzen 5 5600X. But there are half a dozen more models also included. Then I've got the Intel 10th Gen Core series, including the popular Core i5, i7 and i9 models, and due to time I have skipped the 11th Gen as that was a bit of a flop anyway. Then for the 12th Gen Core Series processors, I've tested using DDR4 3200 dual rank CL14 memory and DDR5 6400 single rank CL32 memory, and we have from the Core i3 12100 up to the Core i9 1200K for comparison. The new AM5 test system is based on the MSI Meg X670E Ace, and AMD has insisted all reviewers use the supplied DDR5 6000 CL30 memory, so that's what we've done. Finally, please note all testing was conducted using the GeForce RTX 3090 Ti, Windows 11, and resizable bar was enabled for all test configurations. Okay, let's get into it. Just quickly before we dive into the blue bar graphs, here's a look at clock behavior in Cinebench R23. After an hour of load testing, the 7950X maintained an all-core clock frequency of 5.1 GHz on the primary CCD and 4.9 GHz on the secondary CCD. So there's a 4% frequency discrepancy between the two core complex dies. These results were achieved using the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler installed inside the Be Quiet Silent Base 802. Then for single core workloads, the 7950X appeared to maintain a core clock frequency of 5.725 GHz, so 25 MHz above the advertised clock frequency. That said, the maximum reported frequency was 5.85 GHz, though this didn't appear to be achieved under load, and all of this clock behavior was witnessed on the MSI Meg X670E Ace. Starting with the Cinebench R23 multi-core results, we probably should have included some Threadripper CPUs. I mean, damn, this thing is fast. So for reference, the 24-core 48-thread Threadripper 3960X, that scores about 34,000 points, making the 7950X faster. Perhaps just as impressive is the fact that despite packing half the cores of the 3970X, it's just shy of 20% slower. So 50% fewer cores, less than 20% slower. Pretty amazing stuff. Then when compared to mainstream desktop CPUs, the 7950X is roughly 40% faster than the Core i9 1200K and almost 60% faster than its predecessor, the 5950X. So again, that is incredible. As you'd expect, given the multi-core performance, single core is also very strong, meaning the 7950X should really have no weakness. Here we're looking at a 4% uplift from the 12900K and a 30% improvement from the 5950X. Moving on to the 7-zip file manager compression results, we see that the 7950X is also very strong here, beating the 12900K armed with DDR5 by a 22% margin and the 5950X by a 27% margin. Also, for those of you interested, it was 73% faster than the 7600X, and scaling is poor here as compression doesn't utilize AMD's SMT very well. But where SMT does scale well is when looking at decompression performance, and here the 7950X is 150% faster than the 7600X, which is quite impressive scaling given that there's 166% more cores. Then when compared to the 5950X, we're looking at a 28% uplift and a massive 90% boost from Intel's Core i9 12900K. The 7950X is also a beast in Blender, delivering 30% greater performance than that of the 5950X and a massive 60% more than the 1200K. So AMD looks to be back to dominating Intel in productivity workloads, though Raptor could change that shortly. The Corona benchmark results are also mighty impressive, a 40% boost from the 5950X, along with a 51% improvement over the 12900K. The Premiere Pro 2022 Puget Systems benchmark really surprised me, though it probably shouldn't have given how much faster the Zen 3 based 5950X is when compared to the 5600X. We're looking at a very similar performance trend here with Zen 4, making the 7950X 40% faster than the 7600X, which also meant it was 25% faster than the 5950X and 42% faster than the 12900K. Moving on to Photoshop 2022, and never before have we seen a Ryzen CPU that dominates both Premiere and Photoshop. This is because Photoshop relies heavily on single core performance, and typically Intel has had the upper hand here. However, with Zen 4 that all changes, and the 7950X narrowly edged out the 12900K by a mere 3% margin, making it 24% faster than the 5950X. It's the same story when looking at After Effects. Previously, even the 12600K was able to match the 5950X, but with the 7950X offering 33% more performance, it again nudged ahead of the 12900K. Finally, the last productivity benchmark we have to look at is code compilation performance, and here the 7950X delivered 25% greater performance than Intel's current flagship processor, the 12900K. The margin from the 5950X was also similar, so yet another easy win here for AMD's new 16-core flagship processor. Now onto the gaming benchmarks, and first up we have Factorio, and I'd just like to apologise for a silly mistake overlooked in the 7600X review. Previously, I showed the score for the 5800X 3D to be 200 updates per second, when in fact it's 352. I've now corrected that data for this content and all content moving forward. Also, just to clarify, I'm running the Factorio box benchmark here. Again, sorry for the mistake. Now, Factorio is very cache sensitive and really only looks at single core performance. Despite packing twice the L3 cache to that of the 7600X, it is split into two CCDs, which evidently doesn't work all that well here. As a result, the 7950X was just 2% faster than the 7600X, making it 4% slower than the 12900K when paired with DDR5 memory. The extra cores of the 7950X helped it jump ahead of the 7600X in Watch Dogs Legion, pushing the average frame rate 6% higher, to get within 3% of the 12900K armed with DDR5 6400 memory. That's a 22% increase from the 5950X, so quite an impressive generational leap here when it comes to gaming performance. The Rainbow Six extraction performance was again average, though perfectly fine given that the 7950X was just 4% slower than the fastest CPU tested, the 12900K running DDR5 6400 memory. Moving on to Hitman 3, we find the 7950X is no faster than the 7600X, so both were roughly on par with the 1200K using DDR5 memory. So a good result overall, even though Hitman 3 doesn't require more than 6 Zen 4 cores. Tiny Tina's Wonderland has been included, not because it's a super CPU demanding game, but rather because it's a good representation of how CPU demanding many modern games are. That is to say, when using a relatively modern CPU, most games are going to end up being GPU bound, even when using an RTX 3090 Ti at 1080p, as we see in this example. This game could be useful for testing low-end CPUs, but for the 7950X it just shows that we're able to max out the RTX 3090 Ti here, matching other high-end CPUs. The 7950X was again comparable to the 7600X, this time on F122, where it was just a mere 2% faster, hitting 340 FPS on average. That's a 6% uplift from the 5800X 3D and an 11% improvement from the 12900K. Moving on, unfortunately Spider-Man Remastered also didn't take advantage of all those extra cores, which resulted in the 7950X delivering 7600X-like performance, and that meant it was significantly slower than the 12900K running DDR5 memory, trailing by a 13% margin. Shadow of the Tomb Raider saw a reasonable 6% improvement to 1% lows for the 7950X over the 7600X, and this placed it alongside the 12900K as the fastest CPU tested in this title. Like the 7600X, the 7950X was impressive in Horizon Zero Dawn, hitting 212 FPS, which saw it lead the 5800X 3D by a 7% margin, and the 12900K running DDR5 memory by a 13% margin. The Cyberpunk 2077 results are interesting because despite only beating the 7600X by a mere 1% margin when looking at the average frame rate, the 7950X was able to boost 1% lows by a far more impressive 9%. That said, performance overall was still pretty underwhelming here, as the 12900K was 17% faster, and that is quite a significant win there for the Core i9 processor. ACC also saw little improvement with the 7950X over the 7600X, meaning it was a good bit slower than the 5800X 3D, but 5% faster than the 12900K. Now the rift breaker data is interesting, as the 7950X was actually 6% slower than the 7600X. This appears to be an issue with Zen 4 processors using dual CCDs, as I've also observed this frame rate decline with the 7900X. AMD is aware of the issue and are in contact with the developer to see if there's a solution, so this small performance issue may be rectified shortly. The last game we're going to look at is Counter-Strike Global Offensive, and here the 7950X improves upon the 7600's already impressive result by an additional 5%, hitting an average frame rate of 511 FPS. That makes it 14% faster than the 1200K using DDR5 memory, and a massive 30% faster than the 5950X. Now here's a look at the 12 game average, and as expected, the 7950X is barely any faster than the 7600X, placing it roughly on par with the 1200K, running DDR5 6400 memory. As we saw in the 7600X review, these Zen 4 CPUs appear to handle DDR5 6400 well, and enjoy a small performance boost when doing so, so there is a good chance both would nudge just ahead of the 1200K, using the same spec memory, but either way, performance overall is going to be much the same. The highlights for the 7950X are the fact that it's 5% faster than the 5800X 3D and 16% faster than the 5950X, so some very impressive gains there in gaming for AMD. Now, as impressive as the application in gaming performance is, the 7950X does come at a cost, and that cost is power. Whereas the 5950X consumed a similar level of power to that of the 5800X, which was an incredible feat, the same can't be said for the 7950X, which pushed total system power consumption up to 355 watts. So it's a massive 60% increase in total system draw when compared to the 5950X, and that means it's actually much worse than the 5950X when it comes to performance per watt, which probably isn't surprising, given that the 7600X only matched the 5800X. Still, when compared to Intel, it's hardly a poor result, using slightly less power, the 1200K, for around 60% more performance in this test, so in terms of power efficiency, Zen 4 does wipe the floor with Alder Lake. Now, when it comes to cooling, the Zen 4 CPUs intentionally give the impression that they're difficult to cool by delivering as much performance as possible by taking full advantage of the thermal and power headroom. AMD states that with the new AM5 socket and higher TDP, Zen 4 processors will run into a thermal wall before they hit a power wall. This means under heavy load they'll sit at TJ max, which is about 95 degrees Celsius for the Ryzen 7000 series, and this will be particularly true for the 12 and 16 core models, such as the 7950X. AMD stress that this behaviour is intended and by design, and say it's important to note that TJ max is the maximum safe operating temperature, but not the absolute maximum temperature. In the case of Zen 4, the processors are designed to run at TJ max 24/7 without risk of damage or degradation. AMD went on to say that 95 degrees is not running hot, rather Zen 4 will intentionally go to this temperature as much as possible under load because the power management system knows that this is the ideal way to squeeze the most performance out of the chip without damaging it. The good news being that almost all AM4 coolers will be compatible with AM5, the only exceptions being those that are secured from the rear side of the motherboard, as the backplates are now non-removable. This means that all coolers can now be installed without requiring rear access to the motherboard, as is the case with HEDT processors, so that is excellent news. Now for testing, we're using the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler, which is 100% compatible with AM5. After an hour of looping the Cinebench R23 multi-core test with the Pure Loop 2 FX installed inside the Be Quiet Silent Base 802, we recorded a peak CPU temperature of 99 degrees for the primary CCD and 96 degrees for the secondary CCD, so just above the 95 degree TJ max that AMD says the CPU targets for maximum performance. It'll be interesting to revisit these Zen 4 CPUs using a range of coolers to see how much the cooling performance affects the CPU's performance, but that will be an investigation for another time. Now, time for a value analysis, and we'll start with the gaming numbers, looking at the cost per frame while only taking into account the price of each CPU. As you'd expect, given that the 7950X only matched the gaming performance of the 7600X, the cost per frame is terrible and much worse than that of the 1200K. Really, the 7950X just isn't a gaming CPU. Now, when factoring in the entire platform cost, things don't really improve for the 7950X. It's much worse value than Intel's flagship for gaming, and really you just go with something like a Core i7-12700K, or of course the 7600X, which is similar in terms of value. Again, this isn't a gaming CPU, and the same will be true of the 7900X. These are primarily productivity CPUs that also happen to be really good at gaming, but also not better than the 6 and 8 core versions. So if you're just gaming, get one of those lower core count models and save yourself a heap of money. Now, what the Ryzen 9 7950X is good at is productivity. Really, really good. For professionals, the price to performance isn't something that matters, at least within reason. A product that saves time, saves money. As far as desktop CPUs on a mainstream platform go, the 7950X is currently unbeatable, costing $33.33 per 1,000 points in Cinebench R23, when factoring in not just the CPU cost but also the memory and motherboard. This makes it 17% better value than the 5950X, though again, I'd say for most, the almost 60% boost in performance is a far bigger draw card. The 12100K can't live with it either. Not only is the 7950X 40% faster here, but it's also 7% better in terms of value. For video professionals, it's a similar story. The 7950X will save you a good chunk of time compared to other desktop CPUs, and it's also great from a value perspective, matching the 5950X while offering around 15% better value than the 12100K. The Ryzen 9 7950X really is a jack of all trades. Apart from maybe power consumption and, of course, the price, there's really nothing to complain about. It does everything exceptionally well with no real weaknesses. Even the price, while certainly expensive, for what you're getting, it's actually very reasonable, and as I noted at the start of the review, it is a $100 drop at the MSRP from the previous generation, so pretty hard to complain about that. In most productivity workloads, it stomps the Core i9 12100K, and as we just saw in the price to performance comparisons, it's also better value. As a professional grade product, the 7950X is sensational, but as a gaming CPU, it's really just overkill and a bit pointless. Basically exactly the same situation as Zen 3 then. For example, if you bought the 5900X or 5950X in an effort to future-proof your gaming experience, to date at least, you've unfortunately just thrown away a heap of money. Outside of streaming, there is zero benefit to the 12 and 16 core models over the 8 core and for the most part even the 6 core models, and the same will be true for Zen 4 if not more so. Of course, if you plan on working as well as gaming from the same PC, then nothing does this as well as the 7950X. It's unclear at this point how well Intel's Core i9 13900K will compete with the 7950X, but I suspect we'll know by this time next month, so it's probably best to wait until then before making your purchase. For those of you interested in the 7950X, I feel as though the high X670E board prices won't be a deterrent, nor will the price of premium DDR5 memory. On top of all that, you'll want to ensure excellent case cooling, and above all else, bring a big cooler to the table to maximize performance. On that note, all of the performance shown in this video was achieved using the $125 US Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler, so really quite an affordable AIO, and certainly one of the cheaper components in a 7950X build. As for any additional testing, like what was shown in the 7600X review, I didn't bother showing all of that again with the 7950X because there's really nothing new there. The 7950X scales the same with memory, it can handle DDR5 6000 with 4 DIMMs populated, and resizable bar or SAM scales as expected. Overclocking is something I'll probably look at soon in a dedicated content piece, and as for the big gaming benchmarks, the 7600X and 7700X will be the focus for now. The 7950X though really has impressed me. It's the ultimate no compromise solution, and it's hands down the best at what it does, at least for now. It's actually quite impressive that for several generations now, AMD has been able to dominate with their 16-core desktop CPU. The 3950X made a mockery of the Core i9 1900K in productivity benchmarks, though it did lag behind for gaming. Then the 5950X retired Intel's entire HEDT lineup and demolished the 10900K in the process, even managing to give it a hard time in the gaming benchmarks. The 7950X though has by far faced the stiffest competition from Intel in the 12100K, and yet it still managed to come out on top, comfortably winning the productivity benchmarks while offering comparable gaming performance. So in conclusion, I highly recommend the Ryzen 9 7950X, but I also caution you to wait for Intel's 13th generation core series before pulling the trigger on anything. Though Intel would really want to hit it out of the park with that one for me to recommend you invest in a dead platform. And with that, I'm done here. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a like, subscribe for more content. As I said, 7700X, that's going to be a really interesting CPU. Looking at that tomorrow, and then the day after, the 7900X. So yeah, also, if you'd like to become a Harbour Unbox community member, we have Patreon and Floatplane. Links for those are in the video description. You'll get access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, the two of myself, which will be coming up pretty shortly. What else do we do? Behind the scenes content. Tim's building a new studio, so some good series there. And Q&As. It's a lot of cool stuff, but If you're not interested, then that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time. Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are checking out the new 65-watt Ryzen 7000 series of processors from AMD. So the new non-X Zen 4 parts, let's say. And I'm sure many of you are aware, AMD did first introduce the Ryzen 7000 series back in September of last year, so about 4 months ago now. And despite being very impressive in terms of performance, many of you faced pretty steep costs if you were to migrate to a new AM5 processor because you needed DDR5 memory, an expensive AM5 motherboard, and for that reason, many of you just didn't. As a result, AMD's been quite aggressive with price cuts for the 7600X, 7700X, 7900X, and 7950X over the past few months, and while that has helped, it's only addressed part of the pricing problem as AM5 motherboards and DDR5 memory have been slow to come down in price. For example, today a bare bones B650 motherboard will still set you back $160 US, with very basic X670 boards starting at an absurd $260. Then you're looking at around $150 US for a 32GB kit of DDR5 6000 memory, and the low latency CL30 stuff we use to showcase Zen 4 performance, that costs $180 US. In short, gamers after something like the Ryzen 7 7700X will need to part with $350 just for the processor, then at least $160 for a motherboard, and $150 for memory, so about a $660 platform upgrade for an AM4 owner. But even for new system builders, you can purchase the Ryzen 7 5700X for $200, a decent B550 motherboard for around $120, and a 32GB kit of DDR4 3600CL16 memory for $110, so a $430 combo that in many gaming scenarios it's really not a great deal slower. So I guess the question is, can AMD entice more people to the AM5 platform with these cheaper non-X models? Well, before we find out, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Gigabyte and their NVIDIA GeForce RTX 30 series of graphics cards. For gamers seeking a premium experience, the Aorus range offers a number of excellent models such as the Extreme, Master, and Waterforce. All models include high-end coolers, either with massive triple fan heatsinks or large radiators in the case of the Waterforce series. These aggressive performance-focused designs ensure optimal operating temperatures and maximum power delivery. They're also very eye-catching with stunning RGB visual effects, and of course with the ability to support ray tracing and DLSS, you can enjoy breathtaking in-game visuals. For our Aussie viewers, these models are also available in pre-built systems from M-Wave, PLE, Scorptech and Senecom, so for more information please check the link in the video description. Okay, so at the bottom of the stack we now have the 6-core 12-thread Ryzen 5 7600, which will be coming in at an MSRP of $230 US, and it clocks to 5.1 GHz, so 4% lower than that of the 7600X, and out of the box it does adhere to the 65-watt TDP. Other than that though, it is basically the same part as the 7600X, and of course it's unlocked, so you could achieve 7600X-like performance via overclocking if you so wished. Unlike the 7600X though, the 7600 does come with a box cooler. It's only the low profile Wraith Stealth, but it does work and it will save you some money on having to buy, well, another cooler. There's also the 8-core 16-thread Ryzen 7 7700 coming in at $330 US, and again this is a 65-watt part, though it can clock as high as 5.3 GHz. This model also comes with the Wraith Prism cooler, which is actually quite a decent quality cooler, especially given that it is a box cooler, so that's quite a good deal. Then we have the $430 US 12-core 24-thread Ryzen 9 7900, which can clock as high as 5.4 GHz out of the box. This is again a 65-watt part, and this model also comes with the Wraith Prism box cooler. Now, when compared to current Ryzen 7000 series pricing, we find that the MSRP for the 7600 makes it just $20 cheaper than the lowest 7600X price available right now at $250, though most of the listings are heading back up around $300. So it would seem as though those temporary Zen 4 price cuts are over at this point, and replacing them will be these new non-X models, which I guess makes sense. Now, the lowest price the 7600X has hit over the past few months is about $240. So with the 7600X coming in at $230 with a cooler, it is the best Zen 4 deal that we've seen yet, at least, well, the most affordable Zen 4 deal, let's say. Now, the 7700X, which was introduced at an MSRP of $400, was selling as low as $330, and right now can be had for $350. Therefore, the 7700, which is set to cost $330, will enter the market around $20 cheaper than the cheapest X version, but you also get a quality box cooler, so that is a nice bonus. Then we have the 7900X, which landed with an MSRP of $550, but late last year had dropped as low as $440, but at present is back up around $480. So the non-X model is quite an improvement at $430, and again it does have the Wraith Prism box cooler. So essentially these new non-X models will allow us to officially re-review Zen 4 at a more affordable price point with slightly better motherboard and memory prices, so it'll be interesting to see how they stack up. Now, normally I have quite a few application and gaming benchmarks for you, but as you're about to see, in terms of performance, there's generally very little difference between these non-X and X models. So rather than spend 20 minutes or so going over dozens upon dozens of graphs, I'll speed up the process by reducing the number of applications we're going to look at, while skipping most of the individual game results for the 10-game average. As for testing, I'll be using the GeForce RTX 4090, Windows 11 and Resizable Bar was enabled for all test configurations. Okay, let's get into it. Actually, before we get into the blue bar graphs, here's a look at the all-core behavior in Cinebench R23, starting with the 7600. By default, it runs at a core power of 65 watts with a package power of 90 watts, and this allows for a typical all-core clock frequency of 4,920 MHz. Using the Be Quiet Pure Loop 2 FX 360mm liquid cooler, saw a peak die temperature of 78 degrees. Now, with AMD's one-click Auto OC or PBO option, the typical operating frequency for this workload only jumped up to 4,995 MHz, and that's a mere 75 MHz bump. This did, however, increase the core power to 75 watts and the package power to 102 watts for a peak operating temperature of 83 degrees. Now compare that to the 7600X, which sustained an all-core frequency of 5,240 MHz, just 7% higher than that of the non-X part. This pushed core power to 85 watts and package power to 115 watts for an operating temperature of 89 degrees. Next we have the Ryzen 7 7700, and this model runs at 4,880 MHz out of the box for this particular workload, resulting in a package power of 90 watts and an operating temperature of 67 degrees. Then with PBO enabled, the frequency jumped up by 3.5% to 5,050 MHz, and this modest frequency gain increased power usage by a massive 39% to 125 watts, which also drastically increased the operating temperature to 87 degrees. Still, that's quite tame when compared to the 7700X, which clocks just 5% higher than the stock 7700 for an almost 60% increase in power usage, hitting 98 degrees. Then we have the 7900, which operates its 12 cores at an average frequency of 4,415 MHz, and this was possible at a package power of just 90 watts, resulting in a peak operating temperature of just 70 degrees. Enabling PBO boosted the operating frequency by 14% to 5,050 MHz, but it also increased the power usage by 91% to 172 watts, resulting in a 92 degree operating temperature. Finally, the 7900X ran at 5,200 MHz, 186 watts for the package power, and 95 degrees for the peak operating temperature. And here are the Cinebench R23 results, which confirm everything we just learnt about the operating behavior of these CPUs in this workload. The 7600 scored 14,344 points, and enabling PBO boosted that score by a mere 1.5%. Meanwhile, out of the box, the 7600 was just 4% slower than the 7600X. The 7700 scored 18,337 points, and here PBO was more useful, improving performance by 7% to get within a few percent of the 7700X. Then the 7900 scored 25,062 points, making it quite a bit slower than the 7900X, though that margin was largely closed down simply by enabling PBO, making what is essentially a more efficient version of the 7900X. Looking at the single core performance, we find that the 7600X is 5% faster than the 7600, the 7700X is just 3% faster than the 7700, and the 7900X is 4% faster than the 7900. So the margins here are fairly similar, between 3 to 5% faster for those original X models. So really not a big difference here, and in most instances PBO does a good job of closing that already small gap. Now I'm not going to go over all the individual results for the 7-zip file manager test, rather I'll just show you the compression and decompression performance, but in short the margins are similar to what we saw in Cinebench R23, and that is to say the 7600 was typically just 3% slower than the 7600X. The same was also true of the 7700 versus the 7700X, while the 7900 was up to 8% slower than the 7900X. Adobe Photoshop 2022 generally only uses 1 to 2 cores, so this is more of a single core benchmark, and as such we're seeing very little difference between the X and non-X CPUs here, around a 3% margin. And the last application we're going to look at is Blender, and again these results are very similar to what was shown in Cinebench R23. The 7600X was 5% faster than the 7600, the 7700X 4% faster than the 7700, and the 7900X 12% faster than the 7900. Now here's a look at total system power consumption. From the 7600 to the 7600X, we're looking at a 12% increase in total system consumption, and that's for a few percent extra performance, making the non-X model the more efficient product. Then from the 7700 to the 7700X, that sees a 21% increase in system consumption for, again, what amounts to just 4% more performance in this example. Then we have the 7900, which thanks to its higher core count can afford to run those cores at a much lower frequency, allowing for lower voltages, and it can do this while still achieving excellent productivity performance. And as a result, it consumed the same amount of power as the 7600, but incredibly was 83% faster in this example. It also meant, when compared to the 7900X, that the 7900 is far better when it comes to power efficiency. The 7900X, for example, pushed total system usage 50% higher for a mere 12% more performance. Okay, time for the gaming benchmarks, and again we're going to look at the graph for 3 of the 10 games tested. The results are all very predictable. Starting with Hitman 3 at 1080p, we see that the 7600 is just 3 FPS slower than the 7600X, the 7700 just 4 FPS slower than the 7700X, and the 7900 10 FPS slower than the 7900X. It's a similar story at 1440p, so really it's only this 7900X that offers a noticeable performance gain over its non-X part, and even here we're only talking about a 4% increase. The Horizon Zero Dawn performance is even closer between the X and non-X models. The 7900 and 7900X delivered identical performance, while the 7600X was 1% faster than the 7600. It's the same story at 1440p, so at least in this example, it doesn't really matter which model you use, the performance is going to be much the same. Cyberpunk 2077 is very CPU demanding and therefore utilizes these parts well. It's also sensitive to frequency, so we are seeing some variation in the results here. That said, the 7900 versus 7900X battle, which sees the largest difference in operating behavior, only resulted in a 7% performance variation in this game. The margin is reduced to just 3% for the 7700 versus 7700X matchup, and 5% for the 7600 versus the 7600X, and it's a similar story at 1440p. And here it is, the 10-game average, starting with the 1080p data. The 7600 was on average just 4% slower than the 7600X, the 7700 just 5% slower than the 7700X, and the 7900 just 4% slower than the 7900X. Now these aren't big margins, and for those who care about productivity performance will find these non-X CPUs to make a lot more sense, given they're significantly more efficient and operate at much lower temperatures. But you can also see why AMD went about things the way they did. These non-X parts don't look nearly as impressive on a graph when compared to Intel's 13th gen range. The 7700X, for example, is just a few frames slower than the 13900K, and that sees it take second spot. The 7700 though, which is just a few percent slower, is more of a midfield contender in this graph, trailing the 13700K by a slim margin. Now, as you'd expect at the slightly more GPU-bound 1440p resolution, and I do only mean slightly more GPU bound, the margins closed up a little. Here the 7700 is now 4% slower than the 7700X, so just a 1% decrease there compared to what we saw at 1080p. Overall, the non-X parts are at most 4% slower here. Now for a look at cooling performance using the supplied box cooler, and we'll start with the 7600 using the Wraith Stealth. When placed under an all-core workload in Cinebench for an hour, installed inside an ATX case with a room temperature of 21 degrees, this combo peaked at 97 degrees, so very hot. That said, we know Zen 4 processors target a 95 degree TJ max and are designed to do so, at least according to AMD. And we saw no evidence of throttling under these test conditions, so the 7600 performed as expected, and for reference, under the exact same test conditions, the 7600 peaked at 78 degrees with a 360mm AIO. Next, we have the 7700 with the Wraith Prism, which is a far more impressive cooler, and the results here are far better than what we saw with the 7600/Stealth combo. With the Prism, the 7700 peaked at 79 degrees, so well below the 95 degree TJ max. That's a pretty great result given that a 360mm AIO saw a peak temperature of 73 degrees. Then finally we have the 7900, which again comes with the Wraith Prism. This time we again saw a peak temperature of 79 degrees, so another great result. And for reference, the 7900 peaked at 70 degrees using a 360mm liquid cooler. Okay, so AMD's new non-X Zen 4 CPU is a lot like their non-X Zen 3 CPUs, which were a lot like the non-X Zen 2 CPUs, which were a lot like... I guess I'll stop there, we could go on for a bit further, but I think the point is that they're pretty much exactly what you would have been expecting. A cheaper and ever so slightly slower version of the X counterpart. Basically, in the past, I've always recommended you buy the cheaper non-X version, and I've done this for a few reasons. Firstly, they are generally cheaper and deliver comparable performance. They're more efficient. They're also unlocked, so you can just overclock them to achieve full performance anyway, and they typically come with a box cooler, which you can sell on eBay if you don't need it. The Wraith Prism, for example, that generally sells for like $30 to $40 US, which is pretty crazy given you can get a really good quality tower style cooler for that price. So I'd say, assuming that the non-X parts are at least $20 US cheaper, I'd probably go that way, sell the cooler and pocket the difference. I'm also a lot happier with how these non-X models behave out of the box. They're significantly more efficient, and if you want to overclock them for maximum performance, so power efficiency be damned, well, you can still do that. Now, I thought we might as well create an updated cost per frame analysis for this content, so let's go do that. Before I do though, a bucket list of disclaimers. Firstly, the angle here is for new system builders or those upgrading the entire platform. So not someone who's already well invested in a relatively modern or current generation platform such as AM4 or LGA 1700. If already on AM4, you'd probably just opt for a 5700X or 5800X 3D. And if on LGA 1700 with a lower end 12th gen part, you'd probably just look at getting a 13th gen upgrade. So for this cost per frame analysis, I will be including the current retail price of the CPU, a 32GB kit of memory, and a budget motherboard, since most of you seem to like min-maxing your motherboard and CPU, which I get. Now, because this is a new system build / complete platform upgrade value analysis, we're focusing exclusively on DDR5 memory for platforms that support it. For budget builds, DDR4 still has its place, but that's not what we're looking at today. Having said all of that though, the AM4 CPUs were obviously tested with DDR4 memory as they don't support DDR5, and here I'll be using DDR4 3600 memory, which is available for $110 US in a 32GB kit, though this will be a little bit slower than the CL14 memory that I used for our testing. And you could also save even more money on a CL18 kit, they're about $80 US, but that is quite a bit slower than what we tested with and would really throw off the numbers. Given that the AM4 CPUs are getting slightly slower and much cheaper DDR4 memory for this value analysis compared to what we actually tested with, I'm going to do the same with the DDR5 configurations, opting for $150 US DDR5 6000 memory, and I've also given the Raptor Lake CPUs the same price, despite the cheapest DDR5 6400 memory coming in at $175 US. I would expect to see a similar performance decline for Zen 4 and Raptor Lake CPUs using the DDR5 6000 CL36 memory compared to what is shown in the video. And if that doesn't sound fair, please do keep in mind that the DDR5 memory used to test the AMD and Intel CPUs in this video both cost around $170 to $180 US. Also, because we are using DDR5 memory exclusively for the Intel 12th and 13th gen CPUs, as I feel you really should when building a brand new system, the cheapest LGA 1700 motherboards available supporting DDR5 memory cost $160 US, and that is for a Z690 model. It's $170 for a B670, $190 for a B660, which is a bit odd, and then $200 for a Z790. So let's go with the cheapest Z690 option at $160. For AM5, the cheapest B650 boards are also $160, with X670 priced well north of $200. Then for AM4, you have a mountain of options there, plenty of solid boards for as little as $120 US, so we'll go with that price point. Again, you can also get cheap DDR4 B660 boards for Intel CPUs, but for new system builders looking at spending more than $200 on their CPU, I'm not convinced buying one of those boards at the moment, along with DDR4 memory, would be the right choice. Again, I'd be more inclined to do that with a budget-focused build. Okay, so with all of that out of the way, let's go over the data. Based on current retail pricing, it'll come as no surprise to learn that the Ryzen 5 5600 offers the best value here, given that it can be had for as little as $135 US. Though stock at this price might be drying up. For example, at the time of creating this video, very few listings were still online, so it's hard to say what the future is for that part. Now, looking at the 7600X, it's interesting to learn that at the current asking price of $250, it actually offers the same value as the 7600, so the not-X version, ignoring the fact that it doesn't come with a cooler. And I do expect the 7600X to increase in price back towards the $300 US MSRP, now that the 7600 is available. And of course we will look at that sort of pricing soon, but for now at least, the 7600 doesn't really change the value proposition. Still, in terms of value, both do slaughter the Core i5 13600K, which currently costs $320 US. Now, you could reduce the cost of the Core i5 build by around $100 with cheaper DDR4 memory on a B660 motherboard, but even if we take the same 221 FPS, which was achieved with more expensive DDR5 memory, that would only place it roughly on par with the 7600 in terms of value, and we know from previous testing that the 3600K is at least 8% slower on average using more affordable DDR4 memory. So it would seem as though at present, AMD has managed to beat Intel in terms of value for the 7600/7600X versus 13600K battle. Now, the Ryzen 7 7700 is interesting because, again, it is slightly worse value than the 7700X, which is currently selling for just $345 US, but again, could head back towards the MSRP now that the 7700 is on the market. For those of you building a new system, the 7700X makes more sense than any of the 8-core AM4 options, including the 5800X 3D, as you're getting slightly better performance at a similar cost per frame on a newer platform supporting DDR5 memory with just a much better upgrade path. For gamers, the 7700 also beats the 13700K in terms of value, offering a similar level of performance at a lower price point. Having said all of that though, if productivity is a priority, then ignore everything I just said. The 13700K might be the better option here, depending on your workload. Then we have the 7900, which is a very nice CPU, but also doesn't really make sense for gamers. You're just much better off with a single CCD Ryzen 7 part. And even for productivity, you might as well just get the 7950X or 13900K, though power usage and thermal issues make the Core i9 a lot less practical as a better performance at a similar cost per frame on a newer platform supporting DDR5 memory with just a much better upgrade path. For gamers, the 7700 also beats the 13700K in terms of value, offering a similar level of performance at a lower price point. Having said all of that though, if productivity is a priority, then ignore better upgrade path. For gamers, the 7700 also beats the 13700K in terms of value, offering a similar level of performance at a lower price point. Having said all of that though, if productivity is a priority, then ignore
Oh be. Kafam şişmişti lan.
better upgrade path. For gamers, the 7700 also beats the 13700K in terms of value, offering a similar level of performance at a lower price point. Having said all of that though, if productivity is a priority, then ignore
Oh be. Kafam şişmişti lan.
better upgrade path. For gamers, the 7700 also beats the 13700K in terms of value, offering a similar level of performance at a lower price point. Having said all of that though, if productivity is a priority, then ignore
Oh Be. Kafam şişmişti lan.
For gamers, the 7700 also beats the 13700K in terms of value, offering a similar level of performance at a lower price point. Having said all that, if productivity is a priority, then ignore for gamers, the
Abla bu nasıl dilek?
Ah Nisa, ne yapıyorsun?
Dilek.
Yılbaşı ağacına dilek mi
Evet.
ekliyorsun?
İyilik,
İyi.
sağlık, mutluluk. falan.
Valla.
Evet.
İyi Allah kabul etsin. Bakayım ne diledin?
Yok ya, gerek
Ya
yok.
ne olacak, bir şey olmaz, göster ya. Yabancı değiliz. Ne bu? 1.90 boy, kumral mühendis, opsiyonel. Komik, sadık, yükselenini bilmeyen. 1.90 boy, 1.90 boy. Amin.
Galiba 1.90 boy diliyor.
İyi kanki, güzel dilekler eklemişsin.
Evet.
Başvurular nereden?
İnşallah kabul eder. İnşallah Allah kabul etsin.
Heh. Geliyorum. Tamam. Heh. Şehriye çorbası.